Hi and welcome. I'm Steve Martirano, and this is the Behavioral Corner. You're invited to hang with us as we discuss the ways we live today, the choices we make, the things we do, and how they affect our health and well-being. So you're on the corner, the Behavioral Corner. Please hang around a while. Hi, everybody. Welcome once again to the Behavioral Corner. I'm Steve Martirano. This is my corner. I hold court here. And one of the things we love about the Behavioral Corner is that we talk about life. I like to refer to it as a podcast about everything. It's all underwritten by our great partners, Retreat Behavioral Health. And we're here to talk about the way we live, the choices we make, and how those decisions impact our spiritual, our physical, and our mental health. That's what the Behavioral Corner is all about. And you're welcome to hang with us. That's the whole deal. It's a hang. One of the other great things is that you never know who's going to walk by the corner, come out of the bodega, buy a newspaper over there at the newsstand. And turns out it's an old pal, a very old pal, great friend of this program in all of its incarnations. And that is our friend, Rhona Epstein. We're going to talk about food and eating disorders in I think, a context that you're probably not expecting. And it has to do with food addictions, about which more later. But let me tell you about Rhona. She is a clinical psychologist. She works with individuals and couples and groups and provide counseling services. Yeah, that's pretty much how we came to know Rhona and her work. We were fascinated by the idea that someone could actually be addicted to food. How's that possible? So let's begin there. I know some of your treatment is, or maybe all of your treatment is based on the 12-step method, which for most people means addiction. How can you get addicted to food? How's that work?
Well, I know it is sort of fascinating. And I think a lot of us, we joke about food addiction, probably more like, oh, these chips are addictive, or, oh my gosh, have a bite of this, it's addictive. And then we laugh and just go ahead and have it. But I think for most people, it's not, they don't think of it like a serious addiction unless you're the person with the addiction. You know, we all grow up sort of knowing that alcohol and cocaine and heroin is addictive. And we're warned, be careful, that's addictive. And you kind of grow up knowing that. But with food, like sugar, for example, which is highly addictive, actually, according to science, 8 times more addictive than cocaine in the brain. But we're not taught that it's addictive. We're taught that it's actually given to us as a reward. It's like, you know, when you do well, you get a candy treat, or, you know, when we celebrate, we have cake and we have cookies and we party with food. And so we don't ever really have the same negative, scary feelings about it. And yet people who have problems with food often start their addictive behavior when they're really young, and they start hiding and sneaking, and some of the same behaviors you see in substance abusing people, you start seeing in little children with sugar, the same behaviors you see, you know, with, you know, hiding cookies, hiding candy, stealing from the local store because they can't get enough. And it can get really bad, you know, like to the point where people are severely obese or bulimic and completely obsessed and completely out of control. Yeah. So, you know, if you look at the substance abuse criteria, the issues are identical.
You don't even have to have an elastic imagination to see how it perfectly fits the definition, the classic definition of an addiction. It's interesting, too, because unlike other substances that are abused, even alcohol is not as readily available and abundant as food is in terms of being able to abuse it. And sugar is fascinating. Tell me if I'm wrong about this. Is it not true that for many, many years now, the food industrial complex has used its influence to condition us as consumers to fear fat and disregard sugar? And they've done this with various studies where they try to make it seem as though saturated fats are the enemy, to divert your attention from the fact that they're loading everything they make with as much sugar as they can. That's pretty much what they've been doing, right?
Yes, actually, one of my favorite books on this subject is Gary Taub's book, The Case Against Sugar. And he really documents this whole issue from the beginning of when sugar industry and how it developed in this country. And what you see is actually the politicians hiding information when people beginning to show signs of being ill, like getting diabetes and heart disease. and they started to cover up the science that was coming out and how they were showing a definite increase in these illnesses of obesity and all these things because of the food industry, and everybody wanting more of it. And they just kept on having it. But actually, too, somewhere along the line, I think if you look at the history, it was at the time that they decided that somehow fat was bad, that they started taking fat out of the food and replacing it with sugar in order to make the food taste good. And the obesity epidemic started at that point. So while they were trying to fix our weight by lowering fat, they increased our weight instead by adding sugar.
Yeah, I read some of that excerpts from that book. And I mean, they went so far as to fund academic and scientific research that ultimately was slanted to,
Yes,
upset the whole eating pyramid and convince us that sugar was not as dangerous as it is. Sugar is amazingly, it's pernicious. We all know if you have a sweet tooth, it has all the characteristics of addiction. You crave it. If you don't have it, there is something like a withdrawal, right?
Well, for a person who has sugar addiction, they definitely have withdrawal symptoms. My clients, when they're getting off of sugar, they go through withdrawal.
Well, it's amazing, too, because we know that addictions are a brain disease. The drugs wind up rewiring the way you think and the choices you make. And I'm sure the same is true of food. You make this distinction in your practice because you're one of the few people I've ever heard of who treats eating problems or disorders on the 12-step model. What's the distinction you draw, if any, between an eating disorder and eating addictions? Or is there a distinction between them?
Well, I don't think everybody who has a problem with food has an addiction. I think it's true with even substance abuse. I suppose when a person presents, you don't assume that, if a person can control their alcohol use, they might not need to go into a 12-step program or go into rehab and go to meetings and the whole 9 yards. They might just need to learn how to drink like a lady or drink like a gentleman. They can learn to do that. Then, like I've met people, I had somebody come to see me and her husband was working at night and she had a little baby and she was just bored and she was eating out of boredom. And we figured it out. Like she was never binged her whole life. She didn't have a normal eating disorder history like the majority of my clients. She wasn't complicated. She wasn't deeply troubled. She just had started this habit of binging at night while she was sitting there alone. And, it was like a really easy fix. Like she found something else to do with her time instead of eating, like that's a behavioral problem. It's not an addiction in the sense of somebody who's really hooked and needs to get abstinent and needs a program. If you can train yourself to eat right, then you should have your dessert, but if you can't eat that and learn, if it's always going to be like, if you eat one cookie, then you're never going to stop thinking about cookies and you're going to keep wanting them and you keep craving them and you keep thinking about them and they make you out of your mind, then you may be an addict, it's different than somebody who has self-control. Some people might just occasionally be like, oh, I had a really stressful day. And they might just want to take the edge off with some food. And I guess if they're okay with that, that's a little bit of addictive behavior. Yeah. But that's not the same as the person whose life is being destroyed by it.
Well, that's the difference, obviously, that when you become captive to that behavior, you want to be a social eater like you'd like to be a social drinker. And the emotional component here is what's fascinating. Because you talked about a recent client who was filling up the boredom, the emptiness with food. I know people who eat when they're anxious. Have you seen that?
Absolutely. Sure. All the feelings. That's how I stay in business forever, because once you stop eating, and then you realize the person has been using food for everything. You feel sad, you eat. You feel anxious, you eat. You feel angry, you eat. You feel stressed, you eat. You feel bored, you eat. You feel lonely, you eat. Everything.
Let's continue in that vein for a second. In terms of addiction and some of the things we know about it, what role do triggers play in eating disorders, and what are some of the triggers?
Well, good. Like all those emotions that we just mentioned, they're all triggers. Social triggers. You've got, going to a party. You've got dealing with your family. You've got, work stress, the internal stresses of like, I don't feel good enough about myself to be functioning in this life. And so whatever battles are going on internally with confidence and self-esteem and, all and the body hatred and all that is going on, that's all triggers.
In terms of somebody who's binging, do you have people that come to you and are confused as to whether they're actually binging or they're worried that they might become binging? Is binging something that if you're doing it, you're doing it?
With food addiction, not everybody binges. It's just like substance abuse disorders. Like you've got weekend warriors, you've got people who only drink in the evening, you've got people who start in the morning and go all day. I mean, you've got the whole gamut, right? Some people do this type of drug and some people do that type of drug. Mm-hmm. So it's the same thing with food. You have the whole thing. I mean, you've got people who starve all day and binge all night. You've got people who are sugar addicts. You've got people who are salty and crunchy, kind of more or savory food kind of people. You've got people who graze all day and never binge. They get it like a little here, a little there, a little there. And those are the really tough ones. Oftentimes the very obese clients that I work with, they don't binge. They eat all day. And they don't even realize that. They think, oh, well, it's just not that much. But it's not that much this and it's not that much that.
So when do people come to you? When do they get to you? It's an interesting thing. If someone is bulimic or anorexic, they're going to have some physical reactions to this. They're going to be morbidly obese, perhaps. They're going to be purging. That's the kind of manifestation that would get me to someone like you, a psychologist trained. But there are other kinds of, as you say, people have a food addiction problem. Do they get to you because they're unhappy or their life is out of balance and they associate that with food? It would be very hard for me to understand that food might be my problem if it didn't manifest itself in some big way. But it doesn't always work like that, does it?
Well, I think the people who binge out of control are more likely to seek treatment because they feel out of control.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so those people are more likely to reach out for help because they really feel crazy. And because the dysfunction that comes with it, because the obsession is so bad that you start to not be, your moods are all over the place. You really are not like present in your life. It takes over your head. So you're like in the food day and night. You're either telling yourself you're not going to have it, and then you're having like the negotiations. Yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. And then you always end up failing. And then it's like and then you hate yourself. You hate your body. You hate what you're doing. And it's so life-sucking. And it's very hard to keep living like that. So I think people, when they get to that point, are more likely to get help. Then, of course, people who can't stand being overweight, they'll come for help. A lot of times you'll be in denial about the food problem. People really are focused on their weight, not their food problem.
Right.
So, they want to fix the weight problem, but they don't really recognize the food addiction. And that's really where my job is hard.
That does make your job difficult when someone comes to you and because of cosmetic reasons, they don't like the way they look, their bodies are not right. How quickly do you get to the point where you can say to them, you don't need a psychologist, you need to go on a diet. You need to stop eating. I mean, do you know what I mean? I mean, some people would just go, well, I'll go on a diet. What I'm saying is there are co-occurring things going on when somebody's got a food problem.
When I do a history on with somebody, all of them have been on 100 diets. I mean, the way you get to where they are when they come to me is, the typical situation is you lose weight on a diet, then you gain it plus some. And then you keep doing that your whole life. Lose, gain, lose, gain, lose, gain. And then every time you do it, you gain more and more and more. So they know they need something different. And it's not like a diet's a Band-Aid. And we don't talk diet talk. That word's like a bad word. It's like not, like we don't talk about diets. We do recommend food plans for the sake of learning how to get rid of drug foods and drug food behavior. Because, there are foods that are addictive and there's behavior that's addictive. Mm-hmm. And that has to change. But the focus of treatment for this is really an inside out change. You do have to address the food so that the person learns to eat proper portions and not use excess food for drugging reasons. Because overeating itself, even a little bit of excess food trips the wire and creates more excess eating. So you have to teach a person how to live with a normal portions of food. And we have to teach a person that. The goal is to end overeating and to end the addiction. And the added benefit is the person's weight will come back.
And their health would improve as well. It's interesting because the goal of most 12-step programs, all 12-step programs, is abstinence. That can't possibly be your goal or your client's goal, because we can't not eat. We've got to eat.
Well, that's not altogether true, because, I mean, alcoholics still drink. They just don't drink alcohol. You're not addicted to all foods. A person's not addicted to broccoli and chicken and salmon and blueberries and yogurt. They're addicted to ice cream and cookies and all the refined junk foods that you're getting in the fast food places that you're passing.
Sugar is the culprit.
Well, it's one, sugar, refined carbohydrates, all the processed foods, all the things in the market that you can't read the labels. That's not real food.
Well, someone told me you shouldn't eat anything that's wrapped in plastic anyway.
If you can't read the words, it's not food.
Rhona Epstein on the corner. We're talking about her specialty, which is eating disorders and food addictions. We've spoken about this many times with Rhona. It's fascinating because most people go, addicted to food? What are you kidding? I just love donuts. You know, Rhona, I know Rhona's backstory. It's fascinating as well. She comes to her work from a personal experience with this. You struggled with eating disorders when you were younger, right?
Yeah, I did. I was bulimic. I always joke around about this, but I feel like I came out of the womb looking for ice cream. I was a kid who was sugar seeking, always eating candy, cookies. I lived on Pop-Tarts, Captain Crunch, spaghetti, pretty much white flour and sugar. That's all I ate my whole childhood.
So this is interesting. How much blame do you give your family, your mom? I mean, did you ever have to confront her going, I'm all messed up because you fed me this. Whenever you wanted me to be quiet, you gave me something to eat. Did you go through all that?
Well, I did have a chat with them about it. I mean, I think my parents had their own thing with food. I mean, clearly there was a problem there because, there was a lot of crazy mixed messages. My mom was very, very critical of me about my weight, and that was so hurtful. So when you combine that with a house full of sugar, I have like evil eyes looking at me because I'm becoming chubby. And then I have the food stuck under my nose all over the place. And so I would wipe out entire boxes of Oreos with double stuff, and then they reappeared in the drawer. But then with evil eyes looking at me because I was getting fat. So the whole thing was totally insane, but I don't really think that my mother knew what she was doing. Of course, there was something really wrong with what was going on in the house. A lot was wrong. And so, yeah, of course.
How long were you able to successfully hide the more serious aspects of your eating disorders, your bulimia, for instance? Were you able to do that pretty successfully?
I always say my parents were probably asleep at the wheel. I mean, I was taking amphetamines every day that I got from my friend. I mean, I was doing drugs.
To suppress your appetite.
Yeah, but I was also smoking pot, so I guess I was like sort of crossing each other out. But, but the fantasy was that was supposed to help me lose weight, but surely it wasn't. My parents didn't know that. They didn't know I was throwing up. They must have known that the half gallons of ice cream were literally disappearing in boxes. The whole jars of peanut butter and entire boxes of cookies were disappearing. And you could start to see it on my body, But I don't think they really knew the full extent. I was purging in the bathroom right across the hall from where they were sleeping. And at that time, it was a long time ago. That was like the late 70s, early 80s. And the bulimia wasn't even we didn't know what that was then. That wasn't even I remember when their first little article came out in some magazine where it was a tiny little article where someone talked about bulimia. And I think I was 17 at that time. I had already been full blown into it and I didn't even know what I had.
When did you reach that moment when you had to get help, and how did you do it?
Well, I wanted to kill myself. That was the plan, but I didn't. I ran away for a little bit to my friend's house. I was going to run away to another country. I was trying to find countries that I could live in and be fat where they didn't care because I was so hopeless. You
were already in a country where you could be fat and nobody cares.
Well, I I couldn't live with myself.
Yeah.
And like the alcoholic who gets worse and worse. I mean, it's a progressive problem. So for me, it was just getting worse and worse. I used to be that I could diet myself down, like I could starve enough to keep my weight relatively good, but my eating was getting so out of control that I couldn't keep my weight normal. So my weight started increasing. So I was so full of despair, but I did end up going to a 12-step program when I was in my senior year of high school. At that point, I was going to 3 12-step programs because I needed them. But the food one was the one I needed the most. And I would say it saved my life.
I want to get to the pandemic, but just a couple of other questions. Men have eating disorders, in spite of the fact that you would think this is an overwhelmingly female problem. Men suffer from this stuff too, don't they?
Absolutely. Plenty of men do.
They don't come to you very often, do they?
Well, I'll tell you what, Steve. One of the last times that you and I did an interview together, there was a man who was driving down the road and heard us talking on the radio and pulled over because he was on his way to the Wawa to get a binge. And he called into the radio program and he started becoming my client after that because he heard us talking about food addiction.
How about that? Yeah, that was one of the eye openers for me when we talked about this first time, that so many men have these things. Another thing that I wonder about is, because I know you counsel couples as well. Am I wrong in assuming that there's very often a partner in this, and that both a husband and a wife can really be wrapped up in bad eating disorders and not be aware of it? Is that the case many times? Couples have this together?
There are so many issues around couples. We could have a whole nother talk on that. Whether it's a couple or a family. I mean, the food issues in the family, there's a lot of pressure in families. I have a male client. He struggles all the time because he wants to eat with his family. And his family, they eat horrible. They won't support him in making better choices. And it's dreadful. He's trying to clean up his act with food and he doesn't have the support of his family. But then you also have other issues where the emotional triggers are coming in the couple because you have, let's say, a compulsive eating wife with a husband who's judging her and putting her down because of her weight. And he doesn't realize that every time he puts her down, she eats at him. She's just mad.
Yeah. I often think about people who don't come from backgrounds like ours. I'm an Italian American, you're Jewish, and food is central. Lots of ethnic groups, it's incredibly central to them. And I've often envied those few people I've met who didn't have that in their lives growing up. Like, mom didn't care about cooking all that much, and they weren't interested in food all that much. And suddenly food wasn't this central issue in their lives. They weren't always thinking about the next thing they were going to eat, or where the dinner was going to be and what should I serve. I always thought they were relieved of an amazing burden of not having to worry about food. But let's swing this thing down around to the elephant in the room, which is, of course, the pandemic, which now seems like it's been with us forever. Nothing this epidemic has touched has been made better, that's for sure. How has it affected people with eating disorders?
Well, you know what? I've seen a couple of things. You would think really that it would be worse. I mean, obviously you're stuck at home. You can't get out. For some people, it means more boredom, more eating, more stress with family. So on the other hand, there's a positive aspect. I know that you probably weren't expecting me to say this, but for my clients, they're not driving past the fast food restaurants. They have more control over their eating. So the ones who have been struggling to put their food plans together, they have a better time being able to manage their food plans because they have more time and they're home. So there's less temptation. They're not going to restaurants. So they don't have the temptations of the party and the gatherings where all the junk food is. So they have more of an ability to start to put together their healthy food plans. The other thing that's also been a bonus is that all the 12-step programs are now online on Zoom. And so people who might have been nervous about trying out recovery groups are now able to go to really great meetings all over the world because the meetings are all online. You can go, like I've got clients going to meetings in New York City from Philadelphia at 7:15 a.m. every morning. And they're hitting these great meetings with like 200 people in them. And then there's, other meetings at like 9 at night, whatever time a person needs a meeting, they can go. They're going in different countries, different cities. And so people are trying things out and actually getting help that they wouldn't normally, because you could kind of do it very anonymously. You don't even have to show that you're there. You can just listen in. And so I'm feeling like that's been actually a good thing.
Yeah, no, that doesn't mean we want the pandemic to hang around any longer, but that is an interesting irony about this, that while it's isolating because we're not allowed to be with each other, it did open up the whole area of telemedicine and that connection. Just before we leave the issue of 12 steps and eating disorders, when you say you treat many people on the 12-step model, you're literally talking about the 12 steps, correct?
The exact same 12 steps as AA. And as a matter of fact, if you look at the 12-step programs for food, which there are many of them, there's Overeaters Anonymous, there's Food Addicts Anonymous, there's a whole bunch of ones, but they use AA literature, they read AA literature, and they just identify absolutely with the Alcoholics Anonymous literature. But they use the AA literature because it's the strongest and the best sort of well-worded. It really goes straight to it. And I think for people who tend to minimize the food problem, when they read it in the AA way, it makes them look at themselves more seriously. So they can see the addiction more so when they look at themselves and they say, that's me.
Not that it's a stigma, but it certainly, as you say, focuses them. They have a real problem, and this is a real program. So if I do that, I can get a handle on this. I know that spirituality plays a big part in your treatment very often. Because you've been in the field a long time. If you say greater power, or heaven forbid, God, to somebody in the grip of an addiction, some of them are going to run out of the room because that's just not going to work for them. First let me tell you a story. The only thing I remember from Psych 101, believe me, the only thing I remember was a story the professor told about Carl Jung had a patient that he was dealing with for years, maybe alcohol, I forget, but it was a severe problem. And Jung finally, in his judgment, said to him, "You need spiritual help. Go see a priest. I can't help you anymore." And I remember thinking way back then, because I was as dumb then as I am now, I went, well, that's a cop-out. He just told me to go see a priest. But it turns out that's powerful for some people, right?
Absolutely. Well, the whole basis of the 12 steps is that, if you read the stories in the AA book, that's basically the whole message. It's not just abstinence being the goal, but the goal is to find a relationship with God as you understand him. And you're right. A lot of people do feel like that's not what they want for. They just want to be sober. And for people who go into recovery groups for food, they want to just be thin. They just want their food under control. They just want to have their weight under control. They really weren't looking for that. But I think when a person is at that place, that like Carl Jung's client, and like a lot of people who end up in these disorders, if you've tried everything else and you're at the last station on the train, and you've done everything, I think that's what the whole 12-step thing is. It's sort of like, if you've done everything and your way isn't working, what do you have to lose but to try a faith way of doing things? And clearly, there are so many people in the 12-step programs whose lives have been transformed by practicing faith practices. And so it's sort of like, even if you believe in the power of the group and what's happening in the group, and seeing that maybe if you can't say God, maybe you see like some powerful thing that's happening here amongst these people whose lives have been changed.
Yeah, something over here, something out there, something transcendent. Because what's going on here is not working. Yeah.
The AA literature, though, is very clear that the big book says it's very clear that the intention is to find a relationship, hopefully, with God. And So I think that's really a challenge for people. When a person comes to the place where they have settled the faith issue for themselves and they start to feel like they can pray or meditate or find some peace in that, it's almost like the food that they always needed or the drug that they always needed. It's like the coping thing that was missing. It's like there was a piece missing that we were trying to get in our addictive behavior. We're trying to fill up some empty place in ourselves, or trying to find what we actually needed, but we actually get it kind of in the spiritual arena is where we get that fix that we actually needed.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. I've heard the stories so many times about, and it's never really articulated any better than you just did, but there is a hole somewhere and they fill it with drugs or they fill it with alcohol or any kind of addictive behavior. Until the hole goes away, they feel complete. So listen, we got to run. Your book was called Satisfied, right?
I have 3 books. The first one's Food Triggers. That was a book that's all about food addiction and, all about the whole, how it works and how to get free from it. And then I wrote a 90-day inspirational, inspirational daily readings called Satisfied. And then it just came out this week, Satisfied Workbook, and it is a 12-step workbook. It actually goes through the 12 steps, but it's for people who want a deeper spiritual focus, and it's for specifically food. And so it's a little bit different than what you see in the regular 12-step programs. It's sort of me guiding people through the 12 steps with my sort of way of doing things, but it is the 12 steps and it's a workbook. So
how do people get your books?
You can go on my website, drrhona.com, drrhona.com.
Okay, we'll put all that stuff up on the website, and people will be able to contact you through your website and buy your books and see one of your TikTok videos, because now I know you're a budding TikTok star. So your daughter got you doing that. It's great. I've seen them. They're terrific.
We're just starting.
If you want to see Dr. Rhona, she'll be on our website soon. Rhona, it's great to see you again. I hope you'll come back on the corner sometime real soon.
Thank you, Steve. It's great to see you. Thanks for having me on the show.
At Retreat Behavioral Health, we believe in the power of connection and quality care. We offer comprehensive, holistic, and compassionate treatment from industry-leading experts. Call 855-802-6600 and begin your journey today.
That's it for now. And make us a habit, hanging out at the Behavioral Corner. And when we're not hanging, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter on the Behavioral Corner.